Hello everyone, David Ansardi back here again, and I am getting ready to continue the story on bone growth and development. Now that we've learned some of the terminology that you need to know to continue the story, and we've seen the differences between compact and spongy bone and where they're located and how the osteocytes, where they're located inside the bony matrix, it is time to continue the story. So bone growth and development, we're going to learn how bones grow, and we're going to learn how they begin to develop in the first place in a little tiny fetus while you're still in the womb. So let me get started here. Let me get my pen going. All right. So the processes of bone development, how bone begins to form in the first place, those processes are called osteogenesis. Another term for that is ossification. Osteo, that prefix always refers to bone. Genesis, like Genesis in the Bible, the beginning, to form something. Osteogenesis means bone formation. Ossification is another term for that, where some type of softer tissue gets converted over to bony tissues. So when you were just a little bitty embryo, you had the primitive first version of your skeletal system developed, and it wasn't composed of bone at first. It was composed of softer types of fibrous connective tissue in some cases, and then in other parts of the body it was formed from cartilage, hyaline cartilage. So you have other connective tissues first that are softer, and they're going to get converted over to bone in this process called ossification. There are two different methods by which this happens. Some bones ossify through a process that's called intramembranous ossification, others through a process called endochondral ossification. And so we'll see the differences between those two in a minute. When does this process start? About the time where an embryo becomes classified as a fetus, about 8 weeks of gestation in the womb. So pretty early, just after a couple of months of pregnancy, the little tiny fetus's skeleton is going to begin to ossify. How does this happen? There are some general events here that occur. You have cells. Whenever anything is made in the body, you got a cell that's manufacturing it. Okay, so you do have bone-forming cells. Dr. Pradhan told you in the first lecture that those are called osteoblasts, and I'll remind you of that again in just a minute. They migrate into the connective tissue, and they make something called osteoid. Osteoid are the organic components of bone tissue. Organic here referring to those organic macromolecules, big molecules that you learned about back in Unit 1, things like proteins. So they make that first. That's still a soft type of tissue, and then that osteoid has to become calcified. So Dr. Pradhan, in the very first lecture, she told you how the bone matrix contains a lot of calcium phosphate crystals. That's what largely gives it its hard consistency. Okay, so that softer osteoid, all this calcium phosphate gets deposited in there, kind of like a rock, more or less, and it becomes calcified. After that, bones have to be shaped. So we just learned about how long bones have epiphyses and diaphyses. A lot of that shaping that takes place is called remodeling. The carving of the actual shape that takes place. And there are cells that have to do that job as well. I'm going to remind you about these cells that are involved in osteogenesis. Dr. Pradhan mentioned these, though. Okay, these three types are related to each other. Osteogenic cells, those are the youngest version of these cells. Okay, so they're not really specialized completely yet. They're not manufacturing any bone yet. And so they're located, they hang out in in an adult, you would find some of these located in the connective tissue coverings of the bone that we talked about in the last lecture video clip. Now, some of these cells, as needed, specialize. They convert into cells called osteoblasts. So they change their shape, they start manufacturing different things that they need to make in order to produce bony matrix. Okay, and they become osteoblasts. Okay, and then as bone is being formed, these cells will actually surround themselves in bony matrix that they're making. They make that bony matrix. And after they do that, they again change their shape. They have a different appearance. They have to stop making some of the things that they made before and make new things for their new job as osteocytes. So once they become an osteocyte, they have themselves encased in that matrix. Their job at that point really is just to maintain the bone matrix that's surrounding them. You know, sometimes that bone matrix wears out and it has to be replaced, and that's what they do. Okay, so those three cells are related to each other, and then these cells are a different type of cell called an osteoclast. Those are bone resorbing cells, and these cells dissolve the bone matrix. So they're the cells that are going to be involved in shaping the bones, carving them so they have their formal shapes that they're supposed to have. They also play a big role, as you'll learn about, in helping you maintain appropriate calcium levels in your bloodstream and your body fluids. These are big, giant cells. They're way bigger than these guys you see, osteocytes and osteoblasts and osteogenic cells. And they also have many nuclei inside them. And they've got these little projections over here from which they release enzymes and acids to help digest bone matrix. Do not confuse these two cell types, osteoblasts, osteoclasts. You're going to hear about those all throughout this unit. Bone physiology almost always comes back to these two types of cells. So commit to memory right now that osteoblasts are your bone forming cells, osteoclasts are your bone dissolving cells or resorbing cells. They're breaking down the bony matrix and reabsorbing those minerals that are located in it back into the bloodstream and body fluids. Do not confuse those two. Their names are similar, so it's easy to get them confused. Okay, let's talk about intramembranous ossification. This is a process, again, which starts around 8-9 weeks of gestation in a very early fetus. This word intra means inside. Membranous refers to a membrane. This literally means within a membrane. In biology, membrane can mean many different things, but it always means a covering or a sheet around something. It can be like just a membrane around a cell, or it can be a membrane that lines a cavity in the body. So here, membrane means a sheet of connective tissue. It's a fibrous connective tissue sheet. That forms most of the early skull in the embryo. So it's protecting the developing brain. So that is what's going to ossify and convert over to bony tissue. So how does that happen? So here in this little square from your textbook, all this blue tissue you see here represents that connective tissue sheet or membrane. That's like the early form of the flat bones of the skull. Like you see, little purple things in there, those are the cells that are located within that type of connective tissue. And what happens is some of these cells in the connective tissue, you have osteogenic cells in there as well, and some of those become osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are your bone-producing cells. This little cluster you see here, that's a little cluster of osteoblasts. They look like they're having a party there. They're starting to make bony tissue. They start making osteoid, and again, osteoid is the organic components of the bony matrix. And what are some of those? Collagen. Remember those collagen fibers, long protein fibers that give a tissue tensile strength that you learned about in Unit 2. Very important. And there are proteoglycans in there as well. Those are combinations between carbohydrates and protein. They bind and absorb a lot of water, so they help maintain moisture ultimately in the bony matrix. So those things are produced first, and that's still a soft tissue. Okay, I'm going to erase that. So those little dots you see there, that's supposed to be the osteoid that's forming. Then you move over here to part 2, and notice some of those original osteoblasts have completely surrounded themselves in bone matrix. What they've done is they have calcified the osteoid. So they have deposited the calcium phosphate crystals. Okay. Calcium phosphate, another term for those calcium phosphate crystals, you'll sometimes see those called hydroxyapatite crystals. Don't confuse that with hydroxycut, that drug that herbal drug that some people take to help them lose weight. Kind of sounds like that, but it's not. It's hydroxyapatite. That's just another term for calcium phosphate crystals. Okay, so those cells actually make that and deposit that and surround themselves in it. There are other types of minerals in bone as well: magnesium, potassium, bicarbonate, etc. But calcium phosphate is the predominant type of mineral crystal that's located in the bony matrix. Those cells entrap themselves. Remember I mentioned once they do that, they become osteocytes, and their job is now to maintain the bony matrix. Now on this part of the diagram, they're zooming out further, and they're showing you this spongy bone that's being developed through there. So intramembranous ossification, most of the bone that develops is spongy bone. Okay, so you've got these little kind of T-shaped structures that form, and you've got the spaces in between that have blood vessels in them, red bone marrow. Okay, so provides the blood supply to the cells that have wound up encasing themselves in that matrix. Ultimately, I'm going to erase all this stuff again. Ultimately, if you just looked at a little square of the bone matrix, the bony tissue of a flat type bone like this, zoomed out on it, you'd have a lot of spongy bone in the middle. You do have some compact bone that develops over here on the very edges, and you can see that on the flat bones in the lab. And then you have some cells, some osteoblasts, that continue to kind of hang out there on the edges. And this blue tissue that you see on either side, that's the periosteum, the connective tissue coverings of these flat bones. Okay, what about the other bones in the body? Intramembranous ossification mostly takes place in the flat bones of the skull, some of the bones of the face. The clavicles develop through intramembranous ossification as well. Your clavicles, your collarbones. Most other bones in the body ossify through a process called endochondral ossification. Endochondral, endo means inside, chondral refers to cartilage. This develops within cartilage. So these are bones that start from hyaline cartilage templates. So if you look back over here, I'm going to jump back a couple of slides. There was a picture of the developing skeletal system in a little fetus. And so most of those bones that you see there, they're in the process of ossifying, but they're primarily composed of hyaline cartilage, gristle-like tissue in the fetus. And then those hyaline cartilage versions of those bones have to ossify and convert over to that bony tissue. How does this take place? All right, so here we've got a little tiny long bone in a fetus, and notice that there's a little bony collar that develops in the periosteum, the connective tissue covering around that bone. So you have some osteoblasts that develop in that tissue, and they make a little bit of bone matrix there. And then notice here in the center, so you have some of the cartilage there in the center begins to die. The cells die. They wind up being degraded. And then what happens is you have blood vessels that infiltrate in there. Blood vessels bring oxygen and nutrients. You're going to need that to build bone. And they also bring osteoblasts with them. Bone synthesizing cells come in there. And what they do is they make a whole bunch of spongy bone. So they come in here and they start converting a lot of that deteriorated cartilage over to spongy bone tissue. This is called the primary ossification center, where the hyaline cartilage is first converting over to bony tissue. I should have pointed out over here as well, where you first have bony tissue starting to form during intramembranous ossification, that's also called an ossification center. Okay, I'm going to erase that stuff. And then notice here, the medullary cavity starts getting carved out in that spongy bone in the primary ossification center. What's doing that? Anytime you have bony tissue that's been made and it starts getting carved away, osteoclasts are going to be involved in that. They're the bone dissolving cells. That forms the medullary cavity. And I know that seems like kind of a convoluted process. Well, why'd you make all that bone when you just got to carve it away? And that's just the way it works. Osteoblasts make bone. Osteoclasts come in and carve out that cavity. Notice also they're starting to show you here on the diagram that around the edges of the long bone, remember along the sides of the diaphysis, you have compact bone that's forming there. The cartilage tissue continues to elongate. Okay, the cartilage tissue is actually the tissue where the cells are dividing and growing. Okay, so that process continues. Eventually, what happens up here in the epiphyses, you have what are called secondary ossification centers. In the epiphyses. And there you have spongy bone that forms. So the cartilage degrades, osteoblasts come in, blood vessels come in, bring in those osteoblasts, oxygen and nutrients, and you have spongy bone that forms there in the secondary ossification center. Okay, when most of this process is complete, notice here on the diagram they're showing you that you still have a little bit of hyaline cartilage around the edges of the epiphyses. That goes back to what I showed you at the very beginning of the last lecture video clip. That's your articular cartilage. So you have that at both ends down here. Then notice you've also got this little strip of hyaline cartilage tissue that they're showing you there in blue that's left. Okay, each of those little strips, those are the growth plates that you've heard about before. Another term for those, epiphyseal plates, referring to the epiphyses of the long bones. So they're located right where the diaphysis and the epiphysis come together. Little strip of hyaline cartilage tissue. And I just told you that the hyaline cartilage is where cells are actually dividing and the tissue is continuing to grow. So within those little strips, you still have growth that can take place. Okay, so if we zoom in on an epiphyseal plate and see what's going on there. Okay, so there's your epiphyseal plate, and in this diagram they are just zooming in right there. You're looking at a histology image of this tissue. And what do you have here? Do you see how you've got kind of like these long little columns of cells? Those are chondrocytes that are in stacks inside the growth plate. They are mitotically active. They're capable of dividing and growing. So they keep dividing, and the epiphyseal plate keeps growing upwards like this. Now down here in this region, this is closer, the diaphysis is down in here. The epiphysis would be up here. You're just looking at that little strip in between. Down in here, the cartilage is dying, and osteoblasts come in, and they convert that dead cartilage. It gets carved out, and it gets replaced with bone tissue. It ossifies. Okay? So what you have here going on in the growth plates is that the bone that's forming is chasing the cartilage. Okay? So it just keeps pushing upwards this way, and down in here it's ossifying. As this keeps pushing upward, more ossification occurs here. Pushes upward even more. Ossification occurs down in here. As long as those growth plates are present, those epiphyseal plates are there, the bone will keep elongating this way. Okay, so you have what's called longitudinal growth, lengthwise growth. How long do those growth plates, those epiphyseal plates, remain open? Until about age 18 in females and about age 21 in males. That's just an average. There's a lot of variation, as you know, in heights between females and males, but on average, males are taller than females, and that is due to the growth plates staying open in males longer. And the reason, as you'll hear about in a later lecture, why those growth plates stay open longer in males is due to the influence of testosterone in males versus estrogen in females. Okay, what would these look like on an X-ray? If you took an X-ray of a child or an adolescent who still had active growth plates. So here you've got, this is obviously the hand, here you've got the forearm, you've got the ends of the radius and the ulna, and as you know, bones, because they're very dense, show up as white on an X-ray. Notice how you've got these little black strips. You can barely see that one, but you've got that one there as well. Those are the epiphyseal plates, the growth plates. Very thin strip of hyaline cartilage that's mitotically active. Then here you're looking at an X-ray at the knee joint between the femur, here, tibia, down here, and you can see the epiphyseal plate of the tibia, epiphyseal plate of the femur, that little strip of black there. That lets you know that you still have active growth plates. What happens in an adult on an X-ray of the epiphyses of long bones in an adult, you wouldn't see the epiphyseal plate anymore. You would just see a little remnant of it, just a little line on an x-ray, like a crack. You can barely see it. And that's because those epiphyseal plates are closed. They've ossified. That's when long bone growth stops, when the epiphyseal plates, the hyaline cartilage tissue in there is completely calcified. You no longer have bone lengthening. Let's see, and this last little diagram from your textbook shows you some other aspects of bone growth and bone remodeling. Most important things here, cartilage can grow, and that's especially important here in the epiphyseal plates. That will continue until that gets ossified, and that's important for lengthwise growth. Now, as you guys know, bones also get wider. Okay, so you get a little skinny bone here, and as the skeleton matures, that bone is going to continue to get wider. That's called bone widening, like this is called appositional growth. And in appositional growth on long bones, that largely occurs because of compact bone that's being laid down around the edges of the diaphyses. And let's see, what about bone remodeling? If we look over here, what they're trying to show you here is that, like here on this little outline here, that might be the original shape of the end of this particular bone. But then notice, compare that with the mature shape that you see there on the diagram. So notice you had some bone over here. What they're trying to show you is that originally the bone, there was some bone sticking out there. It got carved off so this bone would have its appropriate shape. That's called bone remodeling. And anytime you have bony tissue disappearing, that's bone resorption, and osteoclasts are going to be involved in any type of bone shaping, remodeling, resorption. All right. I believe that is the end of the lecture. I thought maybe I had one more slide. Take care, and I'll see you sometime in Unit 4.